Today's video is going to be different from my usual content. I won't be discussing anxiety disorders. Instead, I want to share my thoughts on a 4-part Netflix series called Adolescence. I have a deep appreciation for films that deal with severe forms of psychopathology, and this series is a rare example of that done well. This breakdown will examine the entire series in detail, leaving no part untouched. It will include major spoilers throughout, so consider this your warning. But strictly speaking, there is no real narrative intrigue in this drama. By the end of the first episode, footage from a surveillance camera reveals the essential facts of the criminal case, leaving little room for doubt. What we are given is a sketch of the full picture drawn in pencil. The next 3 episodes gradually fill it in with color by exposing the social dynamics within the school, revealing traits of the perpetrator's personality, and unpacking the details of his family environment. What keeps the viewer engaged is a single pressing question: what made this boy step beyond the threshold of the permissible? I'd like to approach the story from a psychiatrist's point of view, first by outlining the psychological profile of Jamie, the central character of this drama, and second by exploring the different layers of causality that may have influenced the development of his personality and behavior, leading up to the crime, at the moment it occurred, and in the aftermath. Let's begin with diagnoses. What is the first thing that comes to mind for a psychiatrist when evaluating someone who has committed a violent, high-severity crime? Antisocial personality disorder. According to statistics, around half of all prison inmates worldwide meet its clinical criteria. Personality disorders are defined as enduring patterns of problematic traits in temperament, thinking, and behavior that remained relatively stable throughout life. These traits typically manifest in the most meaningful areas of functioning: relationships, professional development, and one's own core system of values. In essence, they are exaggerated or overly sharpened versions of ordinary personality features. For example, a genuinely healthy preference for order can, in case of obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, become an inflexible rigidity, an unyielding adherence to rules, and an excessive demand for perfection, which may cause distress both to the person themselves and to those around them. Similarly, a natural human need for connection can, in dependent personality disorder, turn into an inability to tolerate solitude and a tendency to surrender one's own boundaries and values in order to cling to another person. Such traits often take shape during childhood or adolescence and tend to crystallize by adulthood. Personality disorders constitute a distinct class of mental disturbance as opposed to clinical disorders, anxiety, affective or psychotic conditions, which generally interfere with day-to-day functioning in an immediate, tangible way. Clinical disorders may arise abruptly and often resolve completely over time, as in the case of a depressive episode, panic attacks, or alcohol dependence. Being more transient in nature or newly emergent, they often respond well to medication, whether antidepressants, anxiolytics, or mood stabilizers. Personality disorders, by contrast, are largely unresponsive to pharmacological treatment, and the maladaptive traits they involve tend to persist with relative stability throughout a person's life. Key point needs to be clarified. A diagnosis of personality disorder cannot be established before the age of 18. Until then, individual psychological profile is still in the process of development and considered too fluid to draw firm conclusions about long-term pathological traits. At this stage, the corresponding diagnostic category is known as conduct disorder, a clinical label applied to children and adolescents who exhibit persistent patterns of aggression, defiance, and serious violations of rules or social boundaries. So in what follows, I will be speaking in terms of the diagnosis Jamie would likely receive if these same patterns were still present in his adulthood. Returning now to the framework of antisocial personality disorder. This is one of the most severe and chronic forms of psychopathology. Here are the diagnostic criteria that can be observed in the main character. Failure to conform to social norms and laws, expressed in its most destructive form. In every scene where Jamie appears, he repeatedly denies having committed the murder. In the immediate aftermath of his arrest, this denial might be interpreted as a response to shock or dissociation, but he continues to insist on his innocence even 6 months later. The murder itself was an act of unfiltered impulsivity and a clear sign of his complete inability to anticipate consequences. When the psychiatrist asks whether he understands the finality of death or the legal implications of what he has done, he responds with nothing but formulaic phrases and a vacant stare. Over the course of a single 50-minute interview, Jamie lashes out at the psychologist 3 times in fits of rage. Reckless behaviors that disregard the safety of others. This one is self-evident. Murder is the ultimate form of disregard for safety. Lack of remorse after hurting or mistreating another person. She was a bitch, even you can see that. He also tries to justify himself by saying he didn't sexually violate her body after the murder, claiming that other boys in his place would have. As he says this, he calmly chews on a sandwich, leaving the psychologist stunned by his indifference. The admission of guilt he later communicates to his parents over the phone, a year into his detention, is most likely a calculated gesture aimed at reducing the severity of his sentence. Within the broader diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, 2 distinct subtypes are often discussed in the media discourse: psychopathy and sociopathy. They differ across several dimensions, and Jamie appears to fall into the less pathological of the 2. Unlike psychopathic individuals, he is not devoid of genuine emotion and shows sign of attachment to his family. He most likely didn't plan the murder in detail. He was carrying the knife to intimidate the girl who had humiliated him, but acted on a sudden impulse. He doesn't attempt to manipulate or ingratiate himself with a psychologist, and likely lacks the capacity to do so convincingly. Unlike a true psychopath, he shows clear signs of fear. He wet himself during the arrest and is visibly distressed by the prospect of having his blood drawn. There is a brilliant film that explores the psychology of a violent offender in a compelling and insightful way. We Need to Talk About Kevin. It offers a textbook depiction of the development of an unempathic, predatory individual from early childhood onward. The protagonist is a striking embodiment of that trajectory. He lies, steals, feigns emotions to gain advantage, displays cruelty toward his sister and animals, and all of it builds toward a shocking culmination. I won't go into details here because if Adolescence resonated with you, We Need to Talk About Kevin is essential viewing. Let's return to Jamie. Alongside his antisocial features, he also reveals traits that seem to belong to a very different psychological register. In certain moments of his dialogue with psychologists, when the arrogance drops away, the fragility of his inner world becomes visible. He displays what appears to expose unfiltered emotional candor. For instance, when he grows upset while speaking about father's disappointment over his failure in sports. These moments suggest symptoms that align with avoidant personality disorder. He is desperate to be accepted by others. In the final scene of episode 3, overwhelmed by a sense of vulnerability, he loses control and demands with raw intensity that the psychologist affirm his significance. He tends to be excessively sensitive to criticism and rejection. He feels fundamentally flawed and unworthy. He opened up only to the girl he believed shared his own experience of being unseen and unwanted. The assault can be seen as the result of a complete collapse in the fragile psychological defenses that until then had barely protected him from a pervasive sense of inferiority. It wasn't an assertion of dominance, but a frantic attempt to escape from a flood of shame, so consuming that the only way to silence it was to eliminate its source. This also may be explained by the fact that he is still an adolescent. He retains a childlike need for acceptance and hasn't yet hardened into a fully antisocial, unempathic structure. This is precisely why personality disorders aren't formally diagnosed in minors. The psyche remains in flux, and it is impossible to determine with confidence what the individual's psychological structure will look like by the age of 18. Still, the combination of traits we see here, antisocial tendencies alongside anxious vulnerability, is quite rare in real life. These features are simply too deeply opposed in psychological nature. Jamie, most likely, is a deliberately constructed figure, a fictional synthesis designed to embody inner conflict. After all, what truly holds the viewer's attention is not coherence but contradiction, the tension between what a person does and what they seem to feel. That's the dramatic engine beneath most compelling narratives. By the way, in portrayals of adolescent violence, Jamie differs markedly from typical image of a mass shooter, a teenager who enters a school with a weapon and carries out an attack on fellow students. I propose we break down point by point the key distinctions between him and that archetype. Mass shooters almost always exhibit clear or covert suicidal intent. They plan to die during the attack or to take their own life afterward. Jamie shows no such motivation. On the contrary, he is deeply concerned about what will happen to him. Many mass shooters fantasize about a mission, punishing their enemies, restoring justice, making a statement. Jamie doesn't frame his violence in ideological terms. There is no narrative of cleansing the school or making them see who I am. Real-life shooters are often found to have kept journals, drawn up plans, or recorded videos documenting their preparation for a grand act. Jamie leaves no trace of such planning or any attempt to publicly position himself. Typical shooters often display social withdrawal, paranoia, and hostility toward everyone around them, even those who try to reach out. Jamie, by contrast, seeks connection. He wants to be seen and makes efforts to open up, both to the girl and to the psychologist. Most mass shooters are emotionally constricted. They are unable to speak openly about what they feel. Jamie, on the other hand, demonstrates a high degree of emotional insight. He talks directly about shame, the need for recognition, and inner pain. Most adolescent shooters experience complete social isolation. They have no friends and make no effort to be a part of a group or maintain any form of connection. Jamie, by contrast, does have friends. He consistently seeks emotional resonance, tries to be liked. Typical shooters often assign blame to the school, society, culture, or teachers. Jamie's pain is directed inward. He sees himself as the problem, unworthy, different, and unlovable. Several contributing forces can be identified in formation of his inner world, each with its own degree of influence. The most significant of these deserve closer attention. In the second episode, the police visit the school where the conflict leading up to the murder had taken shape. It quickly becomes clear both to them and to the viewer that this is a deeply hostile and tense environment. Students lash out at one another, at teachers, and would likely have torn into the officer himself had he stayed any longer. The atmosphere is so crushing that even a seasoned, physically imposing man from the Criminal Investigations Unit feels out of place. One can only imagine what it is like for a barely formed adolescence. The aggression simmering in this pressure cooker is so extreme that by episode 4 it spills over onto Jamie's father. The teenagers vandalize his car and hurl insults at him. Just prior to the incident, a cascade of provocations and humiliations took place. The girl Jamie was drawn to became the target of bullying over some photos. In response, she humiliated him for trying to show interest in her. What followed was likely a moment of submission. Jamie, unsteady in his sense of self, gave in to the urging of a friend who probably held a grudge against the same girl and steered him toward violence. To what extent did bullying lead to the crime? At first glance, it might appear to be the decisive factor, and yet most of us know all too well that harassment and social cruelty are, regrettably, a routine feature of educational institutions from early childhood settings to universities. Even if such dynamics don't always manifest as a full-fledged system, they tend to emerge in some form within virtually every classroom, every cohort. More often than not, teachers are unable to recognize and prevent bullying in time, and just as often, they fail not only to intervene but even to refrain from participating themselves. Being the target of sustained aggression is a deeply damaging experience, one that can leave lasting scars and derail a person's life for years, if not decades. The education system has a clear responsibility to do everything in its power to prevent such cruelty. But can we really say that bullying on its own is enough to explain retaliatory violence? That seems unlikely. Many children find themselves under that same pressure, but only a few ever turn to violent revenge. As if to underscore this, the series presents Jamie's counterpart, the shy son of a police officer portrayed as a kind and gentle boy, especially in scenes where he feels safe and alone with his father. Most children, one way or another, survive bullying and go on to live relatively stable lives once they've left a toxic environment behind. It's time to consider another contributing factor. The opening of Jamie's interview with a psychologist steers us toward an idea that would likely arise first in the mind of any viewer thinking within the framework of contemporary popular psychology, that the root of all problems lies in the parent-child relationship. Sensing this line of inquiry, Jamie pushes back. My dad is okay. Of course, that could be written off as a child's idealization of a parent, but in this case, we get to observe the family ourselves. Episode 4 opens with a shot of a shed, which, according to Jamie, was the only thing his father ever took his anger out on during rare episodes of frustration. From there, camera moves into the house and stays with the parents for nearly an hour, searching for any signs of dysfunction in the family dynamic. But such signs are practically nowhere to be found. This is an ordinary, intact middle-class family from a provincial town. The parents appear by all accounts to be entirely reasonable people. They treat their daughter with great warmth and, despite their despair, do their best to care for one another. There is no alcoholism in the household. The father, within his limits, tried to support Jamie's social development by enrolling him in a football program. We find no indication that Jamie's cruelty grew out of the family environment. The father's only expression of anger comes in response to being bullied himself, and even then his reaction is directed not at anyone else, but at his own van through a bucket of paint. Day after day, the parents seem consumed by a single question: could they have prevented what happened? A year and a half later, that question has probably become rhetorical. Faced with something they can't explain, the first place their suspicion turns is inward. In situations like this, self-blame is probably the most instinctive response. When Jamie started spending more time alone in his room, they likely saw it as a typical adolescent need for autonomy and chose to respect it, trusting that as long as he was at home, he was safe. Jamie probably didn't complain about anything. They saw him keeping up with school, spending time with friends. They had no reason to intrude on what looked like ordinary teenage privacy. So in all likelihood, without specialized training in child psychology, and even with it, their chances of recognizing the danger in time were slim. What is certain is that they didn't cause it. They were good enough parents. Some reviews will no doubt point to incel communities as a key factor in cases like this. Online groups accused of fueling misogyny and pushing young men toward violence. But over the past 100 years, public outrage had been directed at all sorts of things: marijuana, rock music, then rap music, video games, pornography. In this decade, it's Manosphere. Every generation finds something to demonize, a convenient target for collective anxiety when something horrifying occurs. And yet, consuming a certain kind of content doesn't turn a psychologically healthy person into a criminal. The problem isn't the existence of these communities, it's what people bring in with them when they enter. A young man full of pain, resentment and shame steps into a closed space where that pain is promised meaning, structure and direction. No one has to inject him with malice. He is already searching for it, just to make sense of what he feels. What crystallizes here isn't a motive for violence but a justification for aggression that has already taken root. This isn't about absorbing an ideology, it's about a match between the person's inner landscape and the collective atmosphere of bitterness, shame, and frustrated longing for significance. The internet is not a cause, it's a medium. What makes these spaces dangerous is not their content alone, but their collision with personal vulnerability, in conjunction with the absence of other anchors. People who could withstand that anger, see the pain beneath it, and not turn away. And finally, there's one undercurrent that couldn't be represented in the film, not because it is unimportant, but because it operates below the surface. It exerts its influence on who we are long before we are born. Genes. If we assume that Jamie would eventually receive a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, it's worth noting that numerous studies have estimated the heritable component of this condition at 41%. This figure is derived from twin and adoption studies, methods regarded as some of the most robust for assessing genetic contribution. Researchers examine identical twins who share the same genetic makeup and observe which traits emerge when they are raised in the same family. They then compare those findings with cases where identical twins were separated at birth, allowing them to see how different environments interact with same genetic material. They also examine non-identical twins raised together, where the environment is shared but the genes are not. By collecting data across large samples, researchers can calculate the extent to which specific traits are driven by heredity. Vulnerability to psychopathology isn't inherited in a straight line, it doesn't pass down like a family heirloom intact from father to son. It's more like an echo of countless latent cracks in the architecture scattered across different ancestral lines. Occasionally, a chance combination of these dormant traces accumulates in one person with enough force to generate a pronounced predisposition to disorder. Thus, antisocial personality disorder appears to be the result of approximately 41% genetic factors, 16% familial environment, and 43% other external influences. That 41% likely explains why someone raised in the same household as Jamie, his sister, remained psychologically intact, why no one else from his violent school environment ended up committing a crime, why most members of destructive male communities harbor resentment but never act on it. In Jamie's case, every risk factor aligned: a genetic predisposition toward violating social norms, occasional lack of parental attentiveness, sustained bullying, a lack of basic communication skills, peers who fueled his anger rather than diffusing it, limited sense of belonging, and eventually the spark that set an unstable system ablaze: incel communities. My overall impression of the film, despite a degree of implausibility in the depiction of the protagonist, this is a thoughtful and finely executed work. One of its defining stylistic devices, continuous filming without cuts, brought to my mind Gus Van Sant's film Elephant, which portrays a single school day culminating in a violent act. That movie similarly employs long, uninterrupted takes to create a hypnotic atmosphere that steadily draws the viewer toward the tragedy. But unlike Adolescence, Elephant provides no commentary, no explanation, and almost no substantive dialogue, leaving even more space for reflection on what might have led to what we witness. One aspect of Adolescence I want to highlight is how the forensic psychologist is depicted in episode 3. I've come across online comments suggesting that her behavior casts a shadow over the entire profession, that she pressures a vulnerable teenager into confessing. But it is crucial to distinguish her role from that of a therapist. She's not there to offer care or protection. She is an investigator, a kind of Lieutenant Columbo, if you will. In forensic practice, psychologists and psychiatrists are expected, sometimes even obliged, to employ techniques like building simulated rapport, mirroring a suspect's demeanor, or provoking emotion as part of a diagnostic process. In this case, one such provocation draws out a moment where Jamie demonstrates just how overtaken he can become by rage, and that alone takes a particular kind of bravery to step into the blast zone of that much hatred, even when it is coming from a 13-year-old. Thank you for watching this analysis. I would be glad to hear your thoughts on whether this kind of content captures your attention. If there are characters from other films whose psychological profiles you'd like me to explore, feel free to leave your suggestions in the comments.